The headlights sweep across painted lines in the parking lot. White lines, faded slightly from years of sun and weather, marking individual spaces in rows that extend toward a low building ahead. The car slows, tires crunching over small bits of gravel that have accumulated near the curb over time. The engine stops. In the sudden quiet that follows, there's the faint electrical hum of vending machines somewhere inside the building, and the soft buzz of overhead lights beginning their night shift. A few other vehicles sit scattered across the lot. A sedan near the entrance, its hood still ticking as the engine cools. A pickup truck by the far picnic tables. Two semi-trucks idling in the designated area for larger vehicles, their running lights glowing amber in the darkness. This is a rest area, not a truck stop with neon signs advertising diesel prices and hot showers. Not a gas station at an exit ramp with convenience stores and fast food franchises. Just a rest area, the kind that appears every 30 or 40 miles along American interstates, marked by a blue sign with white symbols for parking, restrooms, picnic tables. The kind of place that exists in a category of its own, neither fully park nor fully commercial space, maintained by the state and open to anyone traveling the highway. The building sits perhaps 100 feet from the parking area, connected by a sidewalk that cuts through a strip of grass. Small shrubs line the walkway, their shapes barely visible in the glow from the overhead lights. The grass is neatly maintained, mowed recently, the green darkened to near black in the night. Beyond the building, picnic tables are arranged in a loose grouping under several large trees, their branches spreading wide overhead. Inside, the building is quiet. Fluorescent lights cast an even glow across tile floors that have been mopped recently, still showing the faint streaks of a wet mop in certain angles of light. The restrooms are clean, functional, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. White tile on the walls, grey tile on the floor, metal stall dividers painted a neutral beige. The fixtures are institutional, commercial-grade faucets, industrial soap dispensers, hand dryers mounted to the walls. Everything is chosen for durability, for ease of maintenance, for the ability to withstand heavy use year after year. There's a water fountain near the entrance to the restrooms, the kind with 2 levels, one higher for adults, one lower for children. The water runs cold when you press the button, emerging in a gentle arc that you lean down to meet. Next to the fountain, a rack holds tourism brochures for attractions 50 miles in either direction, state parks, historic sites, museums, seasonal festivals. The brochures are faded slightly from fluorescent light exposure, their colours not quite as vibrant as when they were first printed. A vending machine stands against the far wall, humming steadily. Through its glass front, rows of chips and candy bars are visible, along with packages of cookies, crackers, and other snacks designed for long shelf life. Next to it, a drink machine offers sodas, bottled water, and energy drinks, each selection backlit and waiting. The machines accept bills and coins, though the bill acceptor sometimes rejects worn currency, forcing users to try again or find exact change. Through the windows, the interstate is visible in the distance, perhaps half a mile away across a buffer of trees and earth berms designed to reduce noise. The highway is a ribbon of pavement carrying a steady stream of headlights in one direction and tail lights in the other. The traffic never fully stops, even at this hour. There's always someone traveling, always vehicles in motion, always that constant flow that defines the interstate system. This building, this parking lot, this landscaped strip of grass and picnic tables, all of it represents something specific in American infrastructure. It's a place designed for pausing, for stepping away from the highway without leaving its system entirely. It exists because at some point in the mid-20th century, planners and engineers determined that people driving long distances needed designated places to stop, and that those places should be safe, predictable, and spaced at regular intervals along the routes they travelled. The story of how these spaces came to exist spans more than a century. It begins before the interstate highway system, before federal standards for roadside facilities, before the idea that government should provide such amenities at all. It moves through decades of experimentation, standardization, cultural change, and evolving expectations about what travelers need and what the highway experience should include. This is that story, told chronologically, moving from the earliest informal stopping places to the modern rest areas and travel plazas that line contemporary highways. It's a story about mobility and safety, about public investment and private enterprise, about regional identity and national standardization, about how Americans learned to travel long distances by car and what infrastructure developed to support that travel. The telling will be slow, detailed, attentive to the textures and specifics of each era. There's no need to rush. The highway stretches on for thousands of miles, crossing plains and mountains, deserts and forests, connecting cities and towns across a vast geography. The rest areas along it have been there for decades, serving travelers day after day, year after year. They'll wait while the story unfolds at its own pace. Outside, the night air is cool. A slight breeze moves through the trees near the picnic area, rustling leaves in a soft, irregular rhythm. The sound is barely audible over the distant hum of the highway, but it's there, a reminder of the natural world that exists alongside the engineered landscape of pavement and buildings and carefully maintained grass. A car door closes somewhere in the parking lot. Footsteps approach on the sidewalk. The automatic doors at the building entrance sense the movement and slide open with a quiet mechanical whir. A person enters, glances at the signs directing them to the restrooms, and walks that direction. The doors close behind them, sealing off the exterior sounds. Inside, everything is controlled: the temperature, the lighting, the clean surfaces, the filtered air. It's a contained environment, designed to be the same whether it's day or night, summer or winter, rain or shine outside. This predictability is part of the rest area's function. Travelers need to know what they'll find when they stop. They need facilities that work, that are clean, that are safe. The uniformity that comes from standardization serves this need. A rest area in one state should feel similar to a rest area in another state, should offer the same basic amenities, should meet the same basic expectations. Yet within that standardization, there has always been room for variation. Architecture that reflects regional styles, landscaping that uses native plants, interpretive displays that tell local stories. These elements add character to facilities that might otherwise feel interchangeable, giving each rest area its own identity within the larger system. The person emerges from the restroom, pauses at the water fountain for a drink, then walks back outside. The automatic doors open and close again. The building returns to its quiet state, waiting for the next visitor. The fluorescent lights continue their steady work. The vending machines maintain their hum. The tile floors reflect the overhead illumination in subtle patterns determined by the angle of the light and the slight irregularities in the floor surface. Time passes differently in spaces like this. Without natural light, without the progression of the sun across the sky, time becomes abstract, measured only by the occasional arrival and departure of travelers. Minutes blend into hours. One day transitions into the next with little to mark the change, except the slow shift in traffic patterns. Lighter overnight, heavier during daytime, peaks around midday and late afternoon, quieter in the hours after midnight. The rest area exists in a kind of temporal suspension, always present, always ready, always performing the same function, regardless of what hour it is or what day or what season. This constancy is part of its purpose. Travelers need to know that rest areas will be there, that they can count on these facilities, that they're not subject to the vagaries of private business hours or seasonal closures. Of course, some rest areas do close seasonally, particularly in northern states where winter weather makes maintenance difficult and usage drops. But the principle remains: when a rest area is open, it should be reliably available, consistently maintained, dependably functional. The story of how this system came to be, how these principles were established, how the network of rest areas was built and maintained over decades, that story begins more than 100 years ago, in an era when automobiles were new and the infrastructure to support them barely existed. 1910s to 1940s. The emergence of roadside infrastructure. In 1910, the landscape of American transportation was fundamentally different from what we know today. Most Americans did not own automobiles. The roads that existed were primarily local, often unpaved, designed for horses and wagons rather than motorized vehicles. Long-distance travel meant railroads. The few people who did own cars used them mainly for short trips within their immediate area, perhaps driving to a neighboring town, perhaps taking a Sunday drive through the countryside for pleasure. The roads themselves were often in poor condition. In rural areas, they might be nothing more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain, developed deep ruts from wagon wheels, and became nearly impassable in certain seasons. In towns and cities, some streets were paved with brick or cobblestone, but these were the exception rather than the rule. The idea of a national highway system, of paved roads connecting distant cities, of infrastructure designed specifically for automobile travel. All of this lay in the future. By 1920, the situation had begun to change. Automobile ownership was growing rapidly, particularly after Henry Ford's Model T made cars more affordable for middle-class Americans. The Model T, introduced in 1908 and refined over the following years, was relatively simple, relatively reliable, and, most importantly, relatively inexpensive. By 1920, millions of Model Ts were on American roads, and other manufacturers were producing their own models to meet growing demand. More people were driving longer distances, venturing beyond their hometowns, discovering that the automobile could provide a kind of freedom and flexibility that trains could not. With a car, you could leave when you wanted, not when the train schedule dictated. You could stop when you wanted, for as long as you wanted. You could take routes of your own choosing, exploring roads that no railroad served. You could carry more luggage than was practical on a train. You could travel with your family in relative privacy, without sharing space with strangers. But the infrastructure to support this new form of travel was still developing. Early highways were often just improved dirt roads, perhaps graded and gravelled, but still susceptible to weather and wear. 2 lanes wide, They wound through the countryside, following terrain contours, connecting towns that had grown up along earlier transportation routes, rivers, canals, railroads. The roads had curves and hills that made high-speed travel impossible and often dangerous. Visibility was limited. Surfaces were uneven. Gas stations began appearing along these highways, usually simple operations with one or two pumps and a small building. The earliest stations might just be a pump outside a general store or repair garage. As automobile travel increased, dedicated gas stations emerged, buildings designed specifically for the business of selling fuel. They were small, often family-owned operations, spaced irregularly along roads based on where entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Diners opened along popular routes, serving travelers who needed meals. These too were usually small, independently owned establishments. A roadside diner might be nothing more than a small building with a counter, a few stools, a basic kitchen producing simple food, sandwiches, soups, pies. Some grew larger, adding tables, expanding menus, becoming local landmarks. But they were scattered, unpredictable, varying widely in quality and cleanliness. Small motor courts and tourist cabins offered basic overnight accommodations. These were the predecessors of motels, simple structures, sometimes just a row of small cabins, each with a bed and perhaps a sink, sharing communal bathrooms. They catered to motorists who needed a place to sleep between longer legs of journey, who couldn't reach their destination in a single day's drive, who needed affordable lodging along their route. What didn't exist yet, in any organized form, were public rest facilities. If you needed to use a restroom during a long drive, you either stopped at a commercial establishment, a gas station, a restaurant, or you found a discreet spot along the roadside and improvised. Gas station restrooms were often crude, poorly maintained, sometimes just outhouses behind the building. Restaurant facilities were better, but only available if you patronized the business. If you wanted to have a picnic lunch during your journey, you pulled off wherever seemed reasonable, perhaps under a tree, perhaps near a creek or stream, perhaps just on the shoulder of the road at a spot with a pleasant view. There was no infrastructure for this, no designated stopping places, no facilities provided specifically for travelers who wanted to pause without accessing commercial services. This informality worked well enough when automobile travel was still relatively rare, when most people took short trips, when the expectations for roadside amenities were minimal. But as car ownership increased and longer journeys became more common, the limitations of this system became apparent. Some states began to recognize that travelers needed predictable, maintained places to stop, particularly on routes that passed through long stretches of rural or forested land where commercial services were sparse. The solution, in several states, was to designate certain areas along highways as public stopping places, roadside parks where motorists could pull off and rest without needing to patronize a business or improvise along the shoulder. Michigan was an early adopter of this approach. The state had vast forested areas, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, and highways that passed through stretches of wilderness where services were unavailable for many miles. In 1918, the state established a forest preserve in Iron County. By 1919, this preserve was being used as a roadside park, a place where travelers could pull off the highway and rest in a natural setting. Some historians consider this the first American rest stop, though the designation is imprecise. The site wasn't built specifically as a rest area. It was a forest preserve that motorists began using for that purpose. but it represented an early recognition that public land along highways could serve travelers' needs. A clearer example comes from 1929, when Alan Williams, a highway engineer in Ionia County, Michigan, placed picnic tables along Route 16. This is often cited as the first purpose-built highway rest area in the United States. The concept was straightforward. Provide tables where travelers could stop, eat a packed lunch, stretch their legs, and then continue their journey. The tables weren't elaborate, simple wooden structures, sturdy enough to withstand weather and use, placed in locations chosen for their accessibility and pleasant surroundings. Williams chose spots with tree cover for shade on hot summer days. He selected areas where pulling off the road was safe, where sight distances were adequate for vehicles entering and exiting, where the ground was level enough for comfortable parking. The tables were spaced along the route at intervals that made sense for typical driving patterns, far enough apart that they didn't crowd the highway, close enough that travelers would encounter them regularly. The innovation wasn't in the tables themselves, which were simple structures. The innovation was in the idea that government, in this case the County Highway Department, should provide these amenities for travelers. It represented a shift in thinking about public responsibility for highway infrastructure. Roads were no longer just pavement connecting points. They were systems that needed to accommodate the full range of travelers' needs, including the need to stop and rest. Other states experimented with similar arrangements throughout the 1930s. The specific forms varied. Some states, like Michigan, emphasized picnic facilities, tables, benches, perhaps grills for cooking. Other states focused on simple pull-offs with minimal amenities. A few states included basic toilet facilities, typically outhouses, simple wooden structures over pit toilets, minimally maintained but better than nothing. These early roadside parks reflected the limited budgets of state highway departments during the Great Depression. Money was scarce. Road construction and maintenance took priority over amenities. What facilities existed were often built cheaply, maintained irregularly, and designed for basic functionality rather than comfort or aesthetics. Yet they served a purpose. Travelers used them. Families would pack lunches and plan to stop at roadside parks for midday meals. Children would run around on the grass, releasing energy accumulated during hours in the car. Parents would stretch, use the facilities if available, consult maps to plan the rest of their route. For many Americans, these roadside parks became part of the experience of automobile travel, familiar features of longer journeys. By the late 1930s, a national network of paved two-lane highways existed, connecting cities and regions across the country. The federal government had provided funding for highway construction through various programs, particularly during the New Deal era, when road building was seen as both an infrastructure investment and an employment generator. The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the New Deal programs, built or improved numerous roads through parks and forests, often including picnic areas and other recreational facilities. Driving long distances was becoming more common, more practical, more embedded in American life. Middle-class families owned cars. Young people took road trips. Salesmen covered territories spanning multiple states. Families relocated for work, driving cross-country with possessions packed into and onto their vehicles. The automobile was transforming American mobility, and the highway network was expanding to accommodate this transformation. Yet access to rest facilities remained inconsistent. In populated areas, commercial establishments provided services. Towns along highways had gas stations, restaurants, hotels. But in rural stretches, and much of America in the 1930s was still rural, travelers relied on whatever roadside parks existed, or they improvised. There was no standardization, no system, no guarantee that a suitable stopping place would appear at predictable intervals. If you were lucky, you might find a well-maintained roadside park with tables and toilets, perhaps even running water from a hand pump. If you weren't, you made do with whatever was available. A wide spot in the road where you could pull off safely, a tree that provided some shade, a creek where you could get water if you had a way to purify it. The infrastructure of this era reflected the decentralized, experimental nature of early automotive travel. Each state, each county, sometimes each stretch of highway developed its own approach to serving travelers. What worked in one place might not work in another. What one state considered essential, another might view as unnecessary. There was no national standard, no federal guidance, no coordinated system. This patchwork approach worked well enough in the 1930s, when automobile travel, while growing, was still not the dominant form of long-distance transportation. But it wouldn't be adequate for what was coming: a post-war boom in car ownership, a massive expansion of the highway network, and a new kind of road designed for sustained high-speed travel across hundreds of miles without interruption. That transformation would begin in the 1940s with the construction of the first modern limited-access highways and the development of new models for serving travelers on those roads. 1940 to mid-1950s. Turnpikes and the integrated service plaza. In October 1940, the Pennsylvania Turnpike opened to traffic, stretching 160 miles from Carlisle in the east to Irwin in the west, cutting through the Appalachian Mountains. It was one of the first modern limited-access highways in the United States. Limited access meant that drivers could only enter or exit at designated interchanges, not at random points along the route. There were no traffic lights interrupting the flow. There were no cross streets where local traffic might enter. There were no driveways leading to adjacent properties. The roadway was grade-separated from everything around it, allowing for continuous travel at sustained speeds. The design was revolutionary for American highways. The turnpike had multiple lanes in each direction, divided by a median. Curves were gentle, designed for vehicles traveling at 50, 60, even 70 miles per hour. Grades were carefully engineered to be manageable for loaded trucks. Sight distances were long, allowing drivers to see far ahead and anticipate conditions. The road surface was smooth, paved with concrete rather than the asphalt or macadam common on other highways. The Pennsylvania Turnpike was a toll road operated by the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. Users paid a fee based on the distance traveled, collecting a ticket when they entered and paying when they exited. That revenue funded the construction of the highway, which had been expensive, requiring tunnels through mountains, bridges over valleys, extensive grading and paving. The tolls also funded ongoing maintenance and operations. This financial model allowed for infrastructure that went beyond what typical state highway budgets could support. The Turnpike Commission had bonded against future toll revenue, raising the capital needed for construction by promising investors a share of the tolls collected. This approach, building expensive infrastructure today and paying for it over time with user fees, was not new, but its application to highways on this scale was novel. One innovation that emerged from the toll road model was the service plaza. Recognizing that drivers on a limited access highway couldn't easily leave the roadway to access nearby towns for fuel or food, the Turnpike Commission leased several sites along the route to Standard Oil of Pennsylvania, which operated them in partnership with Howard Johnson's restaurants. These sites, called service plazas, combined filling stations with dining facilities, providing motorists with gas, meals, and restroom facilities without leaving the turnpike system. The service plazas were strategically spaced along the route, placed so that drivers would encounter one before running dangerously low on fuel. In the 1940s, fuel efficiency was much lower than today. Many cars got 15 miles per gallon or less. Gas tanks were smaller. The effective range between fill-ups might be only 150 to 200 miles. Service plazas were typically placed 30 to 50 miles apart, ensuring that drivers would have access to fuel before their tanks ran dry. The plazas were designed as integrated facilities. Drivers would exit the main highway onto a service road that led to a parking area. The parking area was large enough to accommodate multiple vehicles and separated from the fuel pumps to allow for orderly traffic flow. The building housed both the gas station operations and the Howard Johnson's restaurant, creating a one-stop solution for motorists' needs. Inside the restaurant, travelers could get a full meal, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Howard Johnson's was known for its standardized menu and reasonably consistent quality. The same items were available at every Howard Johnson's location, prepared to the same specifications. This predictability was reassuring for travelers who didn't know the area and couldn't assess the quality of local restaurants. You knew what you were getting at Howard Johnson's. The restaurants featured the chain's signature orange roof and turquoise accents, making them immediately recognizable. Inside, the decor was clean and modern for the era. Booths with vinyl upholstery, formica tables, efficient kitchen operations visible behind a counter. The staff wore uniforms. The menus were printed. The prices were reasonable. It was designed to be comfortable but not luxurious, accessible to middle-class travelers. The gas stations operated with similar efficiency. Attendants filled tanks, checked oil, cleaned windshields. Full service was standard in this era. Prices were clearly posted. Payment was handled inside the building. The facilities were kept clean, the pumps maintained, the operations professional. Restrooms at the service plazas were better than what was typically available at independent gas stations or roadside diners of the era. They were cleaned regularly, maintained to consistent standards, supplied with soap and paper products. This seems mundane now, but in the 1940s, many roadside facilities had primitive, poorly maintained restrooms. The service plazas set a higher standard. This model demonstrated that motorists appreciated and would use dedicated stopping facilities that combined multiple services in one location. It also showed that such facilities could be commercially viable. The restaurants made money selling meals. The gas stations made money selling fuel. The Turnpike Commission made money leasing the sites. Everyone benefited. However, service plazas on the Pennsylvania Turnpike were specific to that toll road. They were not part of a broader public rest area system, and they were operated by private companies under lease agreements, not by state agencies. They represented a commercial model designed to generate profit while serving travelers' needs. This was different from the public roadside parks that existed on other highways, which were free to use and supported entirely by state highway budgets. The success of the Pennsylvania Turnpike inspired other states to build similar toll roads. New Jersey opened its turnpike in 1951, running from the Delaware Memorial Bridge to the New York State Line, providing a limited access route through the state. The New Jersey Turnpike also featured service plazas, operated by various lessees, offering fuel and food. Ohio built the Ohio Turnpike in the early 1950s, connecting Indiana to Pennsylvania across the northern part of the state. Indiana, Massachusetts, New York, and several other states constructed their own turnpikes, each with service plazas of some kind. These toll roads formed the early skeleton of what would eventually become the interstate highway system, proving that limited access highways were feasible, that drivers would use them, and that they could be financially viable through toll collection. The service plaza model established several principles that would influence later rest area development. First, the facilities needed to be spaced at regular, predictable intervals. Second, they needed to offer multiple services in one location rather than requiring travelers to make separate stops. Third, they needed to be designed for safe entry and exit from high-speed traffic. Fourth, they needed to be maintained to consistent standards. Meanwhile, on non-toll highways, the vast majority of roads in America in the 1940s and early 1950s, the concept of the roadside park continued to develop slowly. States added more picnic areas along busy routes, sometimes improving them with better restroom facilities and more durable picnic tables. A few states began to think more systematically about spacing, attempting to place rest areas at intervals that made sense for typical driving patterns. The state of Washington, for example, developed a network of roadside parks along its highways, taking advantage of the state's natural beauty to create scenic stopping points. These parks were simple, usually just picnic tables, toilets, and perhaps a small shelter. But they were thoughtfully sited in locations with views of mountains, forests, or water. California created roadside rest areas along its expanding highway network, particularly along routes through the Central Valley and the desert regions of Southern California, where commercial services were sparse. These facilities were basic, but served an important function for travelers crossing long stretches of agricultural or desert landscape. By the early 1950s, car ownership had expanded dramatically from pre-war levels. The post-war economic boom meant more families could afford vehicles. Suburbs were spreading around major cities, making cars essential for daily life, rather than just leisure. The GI Bill helped veterans buy homes, many of which were in suburban developments built around the assumption of automobile ownership. Leisure travel by automobile was becoming a standard part of middle-class American culture. Families took vacations by car, visiting national parks, driving to the beach, making cross-country trips to see relatives in other regions. Travel by car offered freedom and flexibility that train travel couldn't match. You could stop when you wanted, deviate from main routes to see attractions, carry as much luggage as your car could hold. This surge in long-distance driving highlighted the limitations of existing roadside infrastructure. Two-lane highways were becoming congested, particularly during summer vacation periods and holiday weekends. Traffic jams were common approaching cities and at intersections. Accidents were rising as more vehicles shared the roads. Driver fatigue was recognized as a safety issue, but there was no coordinated response, no systematic provision of rest areas where drivers could safely pull off and take breaks. Officials at both state and federal levels began to discuss these problems throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. The military had an interest as well. The highways needed to be capable of moving troops and equipment in case of national emergency. The experience of World War II, when rapid mobilization and transportation of forces was essential, highlighted the strategic importance of a modern highway network. The solution that emerged would be the interstate highway system, and embedded within that system would be a new approach to rest areas, one that treated them not as optional amenities, but as essential safety infrastructure. 1956 to 1960s, the Federal Highway Act and the Safety Rest Area. In June 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. The legislation authorized construction of the Interstate Highway System, a network of over 41,000 miles of limited access, divided highways designed to connect major cities and facilitate both civilian and military transportation across the United States. It was the largest public works project in American history to that point, dwarfing even the Panama Canal in scale and ambition. The interstate highway system was designed to high standards. Roads would be built for sustained high-speed travel, with gentle curves, gradual grades, and wide lanes. There would be at least 2 lanes in each direction, separated by a median. Intersections would be eliminated entirely in favor of interchanges where roads crossed at different levels, allowing traffic to flow continuously. Access would be controlled, with entry and exit only at designated ramps. The goal was to allow drivers to travel long distances at highway speeds, 50 to 70 miles per hour, without the interruptions and hazards of traditional roads. The funding mechanism was innovative. The federal government would pay 90% of construction costs, with states responsible for the remaining 10%. The federal share would come from a highway trust fund, supported by taxes on gasoline, diesel, tires, and other automotive products. Users of the highway system would pay for it through these indirect taxes rather than through direct tolls. This arrangement meant that interstates would be free to use, unlike the turnpikes that had been built in the previous decade. The system was designed to serve multiple purposes. It would facilitate commerce by allowing trucks to move goods efficiently across long distances. It would support national defense by providing routes for military vehicles and equipment. It would reduce traffic congestion on existing highways. It would improve safety through better road design and controlled access. And it would open up the country for tourism and recreation, making distant places accessible to ordinary Americans. Limited access created a challenge, however. On older highways, drivers could pull off almost anywhere to access gas stations, restaurants, motels, or other services in nearby towns. The businesses along these highways depended on traffic passing by and stopping. On interstates, leaving the highway meant using an exit, which might be many miles away. Between exits, drivers had no way to reach roadside businesses. For long stretches, particularly through rural or sparsely populated areas, there might be nothing available for 30, 40, even 50 miles at a time. Planners recognized that this created both a practical and a safety issue. Drivers needed places to stop for restrooms, to stretch and walk around, to rest if they were feeling drowsy. Without such facilities, motorists might try to stop on the shoulder, which was dangerous and illegal, or they might continue driving when fatigued, increasing the risk of accidents. The fatality rate on American highways was already high in the 1950s. Tens of thousands of people died in traffic accidents each year. Any measures that could improve safety were worth considering. The solution was the safety rest area, a concept that built on earlier roadside parks but integrated them systematically into the interstate network. These would be public facilities, built and maintained by state departments of transportation, spaced at regular intervals along the interstates. They would be free to use, open to all travelers, and designed specifically to address safety and driver fatigue. In 1958, interstate planners issued policy guidelines outlining what safety rest areas should include. The basic standard called for a main building with toilet facilities and drinking water, picnic areas with tables, and an information desk or kiosk where travelers could obtain maps and information about local attractions. The facilities would be monitored and maintained by state employees or contractors, ensuring cleanliness and safety. Parking areas would be designed with separate spaces for passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, with clear deceleration and acceleration lanes to allow safe entry and exit from the highway at speed. Importantly, federal policy prohibited commercial businesses at interstate rest areas on non-toll segments. There would be no gas stations, no restaurants operated for profit, no retail operations. This restriction was intended to prevent unfair competition with businesses located at exits, which had invested in property and operations based on their proximity to the highway. It also reflected a philosophical stance that rest areas should serve a public safety function, not a commercial one. The prohibition on commercial services was debated at the time and would remain controversial for decades. Business groups at highway exits argued that allowing commercial operations at rest areas would undercut their investments. They had bought land, constructed buildings, and hired staff based on the assumption that interstate traffic would need to exit the highway to access services. If rest areas offered those same services on the highway itself, it would draw customers away from exit businesses. Proponents of the commercial ban also argued that rest areas should remain simple and focused on their safety mission. Adding commercial operations would complicate management, create opportunities for favoritism or corruption in awarding concessions, and potentially compromise the public service mission. Rest areas should be places where anyone could stop, regardless of whether they had money to spend. The non-commercial mandate meant that rest areas would remain relatively spartan. Inside the main building, travelers would find restrooms, water fountains, perhaps vending machines offering snacks and drinks. There might be payphones for emergency calls. This was an era before mobile phones, when a traveler with car trouble or a medical emergency needed access to a phone. Information displays would provide maps and brochures about attractions and services in the area. But there would be no full-service dining, no fuel, no lodging, no shops. During the 1960s, as the interstate highway system expanded rapidly, rest areas were constructed in large numbers. Each state had some discretion in design, but all followed the basic federal template. The result was a network of facilities that were functionally similar but architecturally diverse, reflecting regional styles and priorities while meeting minimum standards for safety and accessibility. President Lyndon Johnson's administration, which took office after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, placed significant emphasis on highway beautification. First Lady Bird Johnson was particularly active in this effort. advocating for measures to reduce billboards and roadside clutter along highways and to promote attractive, well-landscaped roadways. The Highway Beautification Act, signed into law in 1965, formalized these priorities. The beautification agenda meant that rest areas were encouraged to be attractive as well as functional. States were urged to incorporate native plants in landscaping, to preserve scenic views where possible, and to design buildings that harmonized with their surroundings. Rest areas should be pleasant places, the thinking went, places where travelers would enjoy stopping, not just tolerate it as a necessary interruption. This emphasis on aesthetics meant that many rest areas from the 1960s featured distinctive regional architecture. In the Southwest, rest areas might incorporate adobe-style buildings with earth-toned stucco, flat or low-pitched roofs, and courtyards that provided shaded outdoor spaces. The landscaping would use desert plants, cacti, yucca, agave, that required minimal water and reflected the regional environment. In forested regions of the Pacific Northwest, facilities might use timber and natural stone in their construction, with steep pitched roofs to shed rain and snow. Large windows might frame views of surrounding forests. The buildings would nestle into the landscape rather than dominating it, respecting the natural beauty that made the region distinctive. In the Midwest, where the landscape often featured open prairie or agricultural land, rest areas might preserve views of the horizon with low-profile buildings that didn't obstruct the expansive sky. Landscaping might include native prairie grasses and wildflowers, creating small restored ecosystems within the rest area grounds. In mountainous regions, rest areas were sometimes sited at scenic overlooks, allowing travelers to view valleys, peaks, or dramatic geological features. These locations served dual purposes, providing necessary rest facilities and creating opportunities for visitors to appreciate natural beauty. Observation platforms or short walking paths might be added to enhance the experience. Some rest areas included interpretive displays about local history, geography, or ecology. These might be simple plaques mounted on posts or walls, describing the area's settlement history, explaining geological formations, or identifying local plant and animal species. More elaborate displays might include photographs, artifacts under glass, or scale models of historical sites. The idea was to make rest areas not just utilitarian stops, but also points of interest, places where travelers could learn something about the region they were passing through. A family driving across the country might stop at a rest area in South Dakota and learn about the Great Plains ecosystem, or stop in Pennsylvania and read about the state's role in the American Revolution, or stop in Arizona and discover information about the Native American cultures that had inhabited the region for thousands of years. These interpretive elements added educational value to what might otherwise have been purely functional stops. They also helped rest areas serve tourism promotion goals by highlighting attractions and historical sites in the area. The displays encouraged travelers to exit the interstate and explore, potentially benefiting local economies. By the end of the 1960s, the interstate highway system was substantially complete in many regions, though construction would continue into the 1980s in some areas. Rest areas were an established feature of the landscape. Motorists had come to expect them, to plan their trips around them, to rely on them for breaks during long drives. The blue signs with white symbols, indicating restrooms, picnic areas, parking, had become familiar markers along the highway, signals that relief was just a few miles ahead. The system worked. Travelers used rest areas regularly. Families stopped for picnic lunches. Commercial truck drivers used rest areas for the rest breaks required by federal regulations governing hours of service. Tourists pulled off to consult maps and decide which attractions to visit. People traveling alone felt safer stopping at well-lit, monitored rest areas than at random locations along the roadside. The infrastructure had been built, the standards had been established. The system was operational. Now it would mature, evolving through decades of use to accommodate changing needs, expectations, and challenges. 1960s, standardization of design, signage, and layout. As rest areas proliferated throughout the 1960s, standardization became increasingly important. Travelers moving across state lines needed to know what to expect when they saw a rest area sign. Engineers building new facilities needed consistent design standards to ensure safety and efficiency. States needed guidelines to avoid reinventing solutions to common problems and to benefit from proven approaches developed elsewhere. Federal manuals on traffic control devices, regularly updated by the Federal Highway Administration, specified standard signage for rest areas. These signs use simple pictographic symbols that could be understood without reading text. A stylized picnic table to indicate picnic facilities, symbols for men's and women's restrooms, a bed symbol to indicate sleeping areas on some toll roads with extended facilities. The signs were blue with white lettering and symbols, a color combination that distinguished them from the green signs used for directional information and exits, and the brown signs used for parks and recreation areas. The standardization of signage reduced language barriers and made highway navigation more intuitive. A driver from another region, or even another country, could recognize a rest area sign and understand its meaning without needing to read English. This was particularly important on interstates, which were increasingly used by international tourists and by commercial truckers from Mexico and Canada, who might have limited English proficiency. The signs followed a hierarchy of information. The first sign, typically placed about 2 miles before the rest area, would indicate that a rest area was approaching and show the distance. This gave drivers time to prepare to exit, to discuss with passengers whether to stop, to begin moving toward the right lane if they decided to use the facility. A second sign, 1 mile out, would reinforce the message. A third sign at the exit itself would direct drivers onto the access road. After exiting, additional signs within the rest area would direct traffic to different parking areas, cars in one section, trucks in another, buses or RVs in a third. Signs would indicate where restrooms were located, where picnic areas could be found, where the information kiosk was situated. All of these signs followed standardized designs, creating a consistent visual language that travelers would recognize from previous stops. Rest area layouts also followed standardized patterns, though with variations to accommodate different site conditions. The typical configuration included a main access road that separated from the interstate with a dedicated deceleration lane, ensuring that vehicles could slow safely before entering the rest area. The access road would be designed for lower speeds, perhaps 25 or 30 miles per hour, and would lead to a parking lot with clearly marked spaces for different vehicle types. Parking areas for cars typically featured angled or perpendicular spaces arranged in rows. The pavement was marked with painted lines, and often with concrete bumper stops to prevent vehicles from encroaching on pedestrian areas or landscaping. The number of spaces varied based on expected usage. Rest areas on heavily travelled routes might have parking for 50 or more vehicles, while those on less busy highways might have spaces for 20 or 30. Truck parking areas required more space. Commercial trucks were much larger than passenger vehicles, often 70 feet or more in length when pulling a full trailer. Parking spaces needed to accommodate this length, and they needed to be arranged to allow trucks to enter and exit without excessive maneuvering. Typically, truck parking was designed with pull-through spaces, long rectangles that a truck could enter from one end and exit from the other without needing to back up. The separation of truck parking from car parking served multiple purposes. It reduced conflicts between vehicles of very different sizes operating in the same area. It allowed trucks to idle their engines if necessary. Many trucks in this era didn't have auxiliary power units, so drivers who were taking rest breaks often left engines running to maintain climate control in the cab. The idling created noise and diesel exhaust that was unpleasant for families picnicking nearby, so separating the areas made sense. Pedestrian paths connected the parking lot to the main building and to picnic areas. These paths were designed to be clearly visible, often with painted crosswalks where they crossed vehicle traffic lanes, or sometimes with raised walkways that separated foot traffic from vehicles at different levels. Lighting was installed along paths and in parking areas to ensure visibility at night, typically using high-intensity discharge lamps on tall poles that provided broad coverage. The main building itself typically followed a simple, functional design. Restrooms occupied the central portion, with separate facilities for men and women. The entrances to each restroom were usually from a common lobby or corridor that also provided access to other amenities: vending machines, water fountains, information displays. Each restroom would have multiple stalls, typically 4 to 8 for women, 2 to 4 for men, plus urinals. The fixtures were commercial grade, chosen for durability under heavy use. Toilets were floor-mounted, often stainless steel or vitreous china. Sinks were wall-mounted or set into counters, usually with separate hot and cold faucets in this era. Soap was provided through wall-mounted dispensers, either liquid or powdered. Paper towels or air dryers were provided for hand drying. Floors were usually tile or sealed concrete, materials chosen for their ease of cleaning and resistance to water. Walls were often concrete block or brick, sometimes with ceramic tile wainscoting in wet areas. These materials were durable and could be cleaned with institutional cleaning equipment and strong chemicals. The goal was spaces that could withstand heavy use and be restored to cleanliness efficiently. Stall dividers were typically metal or plastic laminate, mounted floor to ceiling or with gaps top and bottom for air circulation and easier cleaning. The designs prioritized privacy while maintaining visibility. Law enforcement wanted to be able to check that spaces were occupied safely. Adjacent to the restrooms, the lobby or common area provided space for vending machines, water fountains, and information services. Vending machines were typically leased to private operators who stocked and maintained them, providing soft drinks, snacks, and sometimes sandwiches or other light food. The machines required electrical power and generated some revenue through leasing fees paid to the state. Water fountains were standard fixtures, usually installed in walls with 2 levels. one at standard adult height, one lower for children. The fountains provided drinking water, an essential amenity for travelers, particularly in hot weather. In some regions, the water came from municipal systems. In more remote areas, rest areas might have their own wells, with treatment systems to ensure water safety. Information racks held brochures from local tourism boards, state parks, historical sites, hotels, restaurants, and attractions. These brochures were typically provided free by the organizations promoting their services. They wanted travelers to visit their attractions or patronize their businesses, so they supplied brochures to rest areas and other information points. State tourism offices often coordinated these displays, ensuring that brochures were current and well organized. Some rest areas included staffed information desks, particularly in states with strong tourism industries. These desks were usually operated during daylight hours, staffed by state employees or trained volunteers who could answer questions about routes, attractions, lodging, and road conditions. The staff would have maps available, guidebooks, and sometimes reservation services for state park campgrounds or other facilities. Outside the main building, picnic areas featured tables and benches. The tables were typically concrete or treated wood, materials that could withstand weather and required minimal maintenance. Concrete tables were particularly durable. They could last decades with no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning. Wooden tables needed more care, treatment to prevent rot, periodic replacement of damaged pieces. But they were less expensive initially, and some people found them more aesthetically pleasing. The tables were arranged in various configurations. Some rest areas placed them in open, sunny areas with grass around them. Others sited them under trees for shade. Some provided covered pavilions, simple roof structures supported by posts, providing shelter from sun and rain without the expense of full buildings. The arrangement depended on climate, available space, and design choices. Trash receptacles were placed throughout the site, near tables, near building entrances, in parking areas. Regular trash collection was essential to prevent accumulation and to discourage wildlife from frequenting the area. In some regions, bear-proof containers were necessary. The frequency of trash collection varied. High-traffic rest areas might need daily service, while remote facilities might be served once or twice a week. Many rest areas provided charcoal grills for picnicking families who wanted to cook. These were typically simple pedestal grills, a metal bowl or grate mounted on a post, allowing users to build a small charcoal fire and grill food. Over time, many states discontinued these due to maintenance costs and safety concerns. The grills required regular cleaning, and there were occasional incidents of fires getting out of control or burns from hot metal. Landscaping varied widely by region and budget. Some rest areas featured extensive plantings, lawns, flower beds, ornamental shrubs and trees. Maintenance staff would mow regularly, trim hedges, plant seasonal flowers. These heavily landscaped facilities created park-like environments that were pleasant for visitors but expensive to maintain. Other rest areas were more austere, with minimal vegetation and a focus on functionality over aesthetics. In arid regions, xeriscaping with native drought-tolerant plants became common. This approach required less water, less maintenance, and looked appropriate for the environment. Desert rest areas might feature gravel or decomposed granite ground cover instead of lawns, with cacti, yucca, and other native plants providing visual interest without irrigation. In areas with harsh winters, Landscaping choices had to account for snow removal and salt damage. Plants needed to tolerate road salt. Snow storage areas needed to be designated. Paving had to be designed for ploughing. Some northern rest areas were quite spare in their landscaping, recognizing that half the year they would be covered in snow and that plantings would face difficult conditions. Despite the push for standardization, states retained considerable creative freedom, particularly in architectural expression. Some states hired prominent architects to design distinctive rest area buildings. These structures might feature bold modernist forms, angular roof lines, dramatic cantilevered sections, exposed structural elements, or they might draw on regional vernacular architecture, log construction in forested areas, stone masonry in regions with building stone traditions, distinctive roof forms that referenced local architectural heritage. The goal was to create buildings that were memorable and regionally appropriate while still serving the basic functional requirements. A rest area should feel like it belonged in its location, should reflect the character of the region, should give travelers a sense of place even during a brief stop. In Pennsylvania, some rest areas incorporated architectural features from the state's turnpike service plazas, larger buildings with more elaborate facilities, though without the commercial services. The Pennsylvania Turnpike had established a standard of quality that regular interstate rest areas aspired to match within their non-commercial mandate. In California, certain rest areas included observation decks or scenic overlooks, taking advantage of the state's diverse geography. A rest area along coastal highways might have a viewing platform where travelers could stop and look at the ocean. A facility in the Sierra Nevada might offer views of mountain peaks. These additions enhanced the value of the stop, making it more than just a utilitarian break. In Florida, rest areas sometimes featured covered pavilions designed to provide maximum shade in the intense heat and sun. Open-air structures with large roofs allowed air circulation while protecting visitors from direct sunlight. The architecture reflected the climate, light colors to reflect heat, wide overhangs, orientation to catch prevailing breezes. This combination of standardization and regional variation created a recognizable but diverse system. Travelers could rely on rest areas to provide certain basic amenities, restrooms, parking, water, picnic tables. But each facility had its own character, reflecting the landscape and culture of its location. This balance was intentional, designed to ensure functionality while respecting regional identity. By the late 1960s, the rest area system was mature enough that it had become part of the expected infrastructure of interstate travel. Guidebooks and maps marked rest areas along with exits and services. Travel guides would note which rest areas had particularly nice facilities or scenic locations. Truckers shared information among themselves through CB radio conversations, through informal networks at truck stops, about which rest areas had the best facilities, the most parking, the safest overnight stops. Families planning road trips would note rest area locations on their maps, planning to stop at specific facilities for lunch or bathroom breaks. The predictability of the system allowed for this kind of planning. You knew that every 30 to 50 miles, there would be another rest area. You could time your travel to align with these stops, structuring your day around the rhythm of highway and rest area. The system had become naturalized, an accepted part of how highways worked. It was difficult to imagine now what interstate travel had been like before rest areas existed, when stops were uncertain and facilities unpredictable. The infrastructure had reshaped expectations, creating a new normal that seemed inevitable in retrospect, but had required deliberate planning and substantial investment to achieve. 1970s to 1980s. Peak road trip culture and the rest area as safety tool. The 1970s and 1980s were the high point of American road trip culture. Interstate travel was well established by this time, the highway network substantially complete across most of the country. Gas was relatively affordable for most of the period, despite the oil crises of 1973 and 1979 that created temporary disruptions. Car ownership was near universal among middle-class families. The automobile had become not just a convenience, but a necessity for most Americans, essential for work commutes, shopping, social activities, and leisure travel. Vacations by car were standard during these decades. Families would load up station wagons or sedans with luggage, camping gear, coolers full of food and drinks, and head out on week-long or 2-week journeys. The destinations varied: national parks in the west, beaches along the coasts, historical sites in the east, theme parks in Florida or California, visits to relatives in other states. The common thread was travel by car on the interstate system, with rest areas providing essential infrastructure for these journeys. The highway system made these trips practical in ways that hadn't been possible before. You could drive from New York to Los Angeles in 4 or 5 days of steady travel. You could go from Chicago to Miami in 2 days. The interstates eliminated the slow navigation through small towns that had characterized earlier highway travel. You could maintain steady speeds for hours, covering hundreds of miles in a day, without the stops and starts and delays that 2-lane highways had imposed. Rest areas made these long days of driving tolerable, particularly for families with children. A family might leave home early in the morning, drive 3 or 4 hours, then stop at a rest area for a mid-morning bathroom break. The children could run around on the grass, releasing energy that had built up from sitting in the car. The parents could stretch their legs, use the facilities, consult maps to check their progress and plan the rest of the day's route. Lunch might be eaten at another rest area, the family pulling sandwiches and snacks from a cooler, sitting at a picnic table under trees, taking their time before getting back on the road. An afternoon break might come 3 or 4 hours later, another bathroom stop, maybe switching drivers if 2 adults were sharing the driving duties. By evening, they would exit the interstate to find a motel, have dinner at a restaurant, sleep, and then repeat the pattern the next day. This rhythm of driving and stopping, highway miles and rest area breaks, became deeply familiar to a generation of Americans who grew up taking family road trips. The rest areas became part of the texture of these journeys, memorable not for anything distinctive about individual facilities, but for their cumulative presence, their reliable availability, their role in making long drives manageable. During this period, rest areas were increasingly framed as tools for highway safety, particularly in campaigns against drowsy driving. Public service announcements on television and radio urged motorists to take a break when feeling tired, emphasizing that fatigue impaired driving ability as much as alcohol. Rest areas were explicitly promoted as appropriate places for short naps, safe alternatives to continuing to drive when drowsy. This safety messaging aligned with growing research into driver fatigue as a cause of accidents. Studies conducted in the 1970s and 1980s showed that long periods of sustained driving, particularly on monotonous interstate highways, could induce a kind of highway hypnosis, a state of reduced alertness where drivers might drift across lanes, fail to notice changing traffic conditions, or have delayed reactions to hazards. The straight, featureless stretches of many interstates, combined with the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic passage of white lane markers, could have an almost sedative effect. Regular breaks, even brief ones, could counteract this effect. Getting out of the car, walking around, breathing fresh air, splashing water on your face, these simple actions could restore alertness. Even a 20-minute nap could make a significant difference in a driver's ability to maintain attention and react to road conditions. Rest areas provided a safe, legal place to take these breaks. Unlike stopping on the shoulder, which was both dangerous and illegal in most states, rest areas offered designated parking where drivers could turn off their engines, get out and walk around, or recline their seats for a short nap. The parking areas were well lit at night, separated from highway traffic, and generally monitored, providing a secure environment for these stops. Law enforcement generally tolerated overnight parking at rest areas, particularly for commercial truck drivers who were required by federal regulations to take rest breaks. Hours of service rules limited how many hours truck drivers could be on duty and mandated rest periods. Rest areas provided obvious locations for these mandated breaks, and state police understood that allowing trucks to park overnight at rest areas was safer than having drivers continue on when they had exhausted their legal driving hours. For families, rest areas served multiple functions beyond safety. They were bathroom stops, obviously, an essential need when traveling with children who couldn't wait for hours between opportunities. Young children in particular needed frequent bathroom breaks, and rest areas provided these at predictable intervals. Parents could tell children, "We'll stop at the next rest area," and know that one would appear within a reasonable time. Rest areas were also places where children could release physical energy. Long car rides were boring for children, who had limited capacity to sit still for hours. At rest areas, they could run around on the grass, play informal games, climb on playground equipment where it was provided, simply move their bodies after hours of confinement. This physical activity made the next segment of driving more tolerable, as children would be tired from playing and more willing to sit quietly for a while. Some rest areas added playground equipment during the 1970s and 1980s, recognizing that families made up a significant portion of rest area users. The playgrounds were usually simple, metal slides, swing sets, perhaps a climbing structure or merry-go-round. The equipment was positioned away from the parking area for safety, usually in a corner of the picnic area or in a dedicated space surrounded by grass or soft ground cover. These playgrounds became destinations within the rest area system for families with young children. Parents would seek out rest areas that had playground equipment, planning their stops accordingly. Children would look forward to these stops as highlights of the journey, brief periods of fun breaking up the monotony of highway travel. The equipment was basic, nothing elaborate, but it served its purpose. The picnic facilities at rest areas were heavily used during this period. Many families, trying to save money on vacation expenses, would pack coolers full of food rather than eating at restaurants for every meal. Lunch at a rest area picnic table became a standard practice. Families would bring sandwiches, fruit, chips, drinks, portable foods that didn't require cooking, Some brought more elaborate spreads, fried chicken packed from home, potato salad in containers, homemade cookies for dessert. The picnic tables provided a place to spread out the food, to sit together as a family, to eat in a more relaxed manner than was possible in the car. Parents appreciated the break from driving, the chance to eat without navigating traffic. Children appreciated the change of scenery, the opportunity to sit at a table instead of in a car seat. The simple act of eating lunch at a picnic table, surrounded by grass and trees, with the highway visible in the distance, became one of the defining experiences of American road trip culture during these decades. Architecturally, rest areas from the 1970s often reflected the era's design trends. Modernist influences were common: concrete buildings with angular forms, geometric patterns, exposed structural elements. The aesthetic was functional and forward-looking, sometimes almost brutalist in its raw concrete and bold shapes. These buildings made no attempt to blend into the landscape. Instead, they announced their presence, creating distinctive landmarks along the highway. Some rest areas featured dramatic roof lines, often with wide overhangs that provided shelter from rain or sun. These overhangs created covered walkways between parking areas and building entrances, allowing visitors to move between car and facilities without exposure to weather. In regions with heavy snow, the overhangs also helped prevent snow accumulation near doorways and facilitated snow removal. Other facilities experimented with more futuristic aesthetics, incorporating curved forms, unusual materials, or innovative structural systems. A rest area might feature a hyperbolic paraboloid roof, a saddle-shaped surface created by curved structural elements that was both structurally efficient and visually striking. Or it might use exposed steel trusses, supporting a roof that seemed to float above the building, creating an open, airy feeling. Windows were often large, allowing natural light into the interior during daytime and providing views of the surrounding landscape. Some rest areas featured clear-story windows, high windows near the roof line, that brought in light while maintaining privacy in restrooms. The use of natural light reduced energy costs and created more pleasant interior environments. Inside the buildings, facilities remained basic but showed incremental improvements over earlier decades. Lighting became brighter and more efficient, with fluorescent fixtures replacing older incandescent systems. The brighter lighting improved safety and made facilities feel cleaner and more welcoming. Restroom fixtures were updated for durability and water efficiency. Toilets increasingly featured low-flow designs that reduced water consumption. Faucets moved toward more durable commercial designs that could withstand heavy use. Some facilities began installing automatic faucets that turned on when hands were placed under them and turned off automatically, reducing water waste from faucets left running. Vending machines expanded beyond simple soda and snack offerings. In addition to soft drinks and candy bars, machines began offering a wider variety of snacks: chips, cookies, crackers, nuts. Some rest areas installed food vending machines that offered sandwiches, milk, and juice. A few facilities experimented with hot beverage machines that could dispense coffee, hot chocolate, or soup. Though these machines were often unreliable and were discontinued at many locations, the expansion of vending options reflected changing expectations about what rest areas should provide. while the facilities remained non-commercial in the sense that they couldn't have full-service restaurants or stores. Vending machines offered a way to provide food and drink options without violating the prohibition on commercial operations. The machines were leased to private operators who stocked and maintained them, with the state receiving a percentage of revenue. Payphones were standard features at rest areas during this period, usually located in sheltered alcoves outside the main building or inside near the entrance. These phones were essential infrastructure in an era before mobile phones. A traveler who had car trouble, or who needed to contact family, or who faced a medical emergency, needed access to a phone. Many rest area phones were equipped for emergency calls and could connect to highway patrol or local emergency services. The phones were coin-operated, requiring quarters for long-distance calls. Some were equipped with credit card readers. The phone booths or alcoves provided some privacy and protection from weather. At night, they were well lit, making them visible from the parking area and providing security for users. Information services also expanded during the 1970s and 1980s. Many rest areas featured large map displays showing the interstate network, with markers indicating the current location. These maps helped travelers orient themselves, understand where they were in relation to their destination, and plan their route for the upcoming segments of their journey. The maps were usually mounted on walls, protected by plexiglass to prevent vandalism and weather damage. They showed not just highways, but also major cities, state boundaries, and sometimes points of interest. Some included distance markers showing mileage to major destinations. These displays were particularly valuable before the era of GPS navigation, when travelers relied on paper maps and their own sense of direction. Brochure racks offered materials from local tourism boards, advertising attractions, hotels, restaurants, and services at upcoming exits. These brochures were free to take, and many travelers collected them, using the information to decide where to stop for the night, which attractions to visit, which restaurants to try. The brochures were colourful, designed to catch the eye and entice visitors. They represented the first contact many travelers had with destinations in the area. Some states installed staffed information desks at major rest areas during peak travel seasons. These desks were typically operated during daylight hours, perhaps from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., and staffed by state employees or trained volunteers who could answer questions about routes, attractions, lodging, and road conditions. The staff would have detailed maps available, guidebooks to state parks and attractions, and sometimes the ability to make reservations for state campgrounds or other facilities. The information desk attendants became valuable resources for travelers, particularly those who were unfamiliar with the area. They could recommend routes that avoided construction or heavy traffic. They could suggest attractions that were appropriate for families with children. They could provide directions to hotels or restaurants. For travelers before the Internet era, when information was less readily accessible, these human sources of local knowledge were genuinely helpful. Regional interpretive displays became more elaborate at some rest areas during this period. Historical markers described significant events or figures associated with the area. Battles fought nearby, famous residents, important industries, cultural movements. The markers might include photographs, drawings, or maps that illustrated the information being presented. Natural history exhibits explained local ecology or geology. A rest area in a region with distinctive geological features might have displays explaining how those features formed. A facility in an area with unique ecosystems might describe the plants and animals that lived there. These exhibits served educational purposes, helping travelers understand the landscape they were passing through. In some cases, rest areas near scenic features included observation platforms or short walking trails. A rest area at a high elevation might have a viewing platform where travelers could look out over valleys or mountain ranges. A facility near a river might include a short path down to the water's edge. These additions encouraged travelers to spend a few extra minutes at the rest area to experience the landscape more directly than they could from the highway. The 1980s brought some technological updates to rest areas, though the pace of change was slow compared to what would come in later decades. Electronic information kiosks began appearing at select rest areas, offering touchscreen access to maps and attraction information. These were early, often unreliable systems. The touchscreens were sometimes unresponsive, the software crashed frequently, the information was often outdated. But they represented an attempt to modernize rest area services, to provide information in new formats beyond paper maps and brochures. CB radio, which had become popular among truck drivers in the 1970s, helped spread information about rest area conditions. Truckers would communicate with each other over CB channels, sharing reports about which rest areas had parking available, which had clean facilities, which to avoid due to maintenance problems or security concerns. This informal network helped drivers make decisions about where to stop. The CB conversations created a kind of collective knowledge about rest areas along major freight routes. Drivers learned which facilities were truck-friendly, which had adequate parking, which were well maintained. This information was particularly valuable for overnight stops when drivers needed to park for several hours and wanted safe, quiet locations. Truck stops, meanwhile, continued to evolve in parallel to public rest areas, though located at highway exits rather than within the highway right-of-way. What had started in the 1940s and 1950s as simple gas stations with attached diners had grown by the 1970s and 1980s into larger complexes offering fuel, food, showers, and services specifically for commercial drivers. The larger truck stops of this era might have multiple fuel islands serving diesel and gasoline. The fuel operations were typically self-service by the 1980s, with credit card readers at the pumps allowing drivers to fuel without going inside to pay. For truckers, fuel purchases were business expenses, often paid with fleet cards that provided detailed records for accounting and tax purposes. Inside, the truck stops had convenience stores stocking food, drinks, automotive supplies, and travel necessities. The stores were larger than typical gas station convenience stores, carrying wider selections to meet the needs of drivers who might be on the road for days or weeks at a time. You could buy groceries, over-the-counter medications, clothing basics, CB radios and accessories, truck parts, maps, and guidebooks. Restaurants at truck stops ranged from simple diners to larger operations serving dozens of customers at a time. The food was typically American diner fare. Breakfast served all day, burgers and sandwiches, blue plate specials, coffee always available. The atmosphere was functional rather than refined, designed to serve people quickly and get them back on the road. Shower facilities became standard at larger truck stops by the 1980s. Long-haul truck drivers might be on the road for weeks, sleeping in their cabs, and they needed places to maintain personal hygiene. Truck stops installed private shower rooms, small spaces with a shower, toilet, sink, and bench that drivers could rent for a fee, typically around $5 to $10. The shower rooms were cleaned between users, and the better truck stops maintained them to reasonable standards. Some truck stops added laundry facilities, coin-operated washers and dryers that drivers could use to clean clothes during their trips. Drivers' lounges provided comfortable seating, televisions, and sometimes video games or other entertainment. These amenities recognized that truck drivers weren't just passing through. They were living on the road, and they needed facilities that supported that lifestyle. Major chains began consolidating the truck stop industry during this period. Flying J, founded in 1968, expanded throughout the 1970s and 1980s, building standardized facilities at strategic locations along major freight corridors. Pilot, Travel Centers of America, and other chains followed similar strategies, creating networks of truck stops that offered predictable services and quality across locations. These commercial truck stops existed in a different economic and regulatory category than public rest areas. They were private businesses, operating on privately owned land accessed from highway exits. They could offer a full range of commercial services: fuel sales, restaurants, convenience stores, truck maintenance and repairs, and more. Federal regulations that prohibited commercial activity at rest areas didn't apply to exit-based businesses. The division between public rest areas and private truck stops created a two-tier system that persisted through these decades and continues today. Rest areas offered basic amenities for free, funded by state transportation budgets. Truck stops offered extensive services for a fee, funded by commercial revenue. Motorists could choose based on their needs and budget: a quick, free stop at a rest area for basic necessities, or a full-service stop at a truck stop with more options but higher cost. For professional truck drivers, this division had practical implications. Federal hours of service regulations, which had been in place since the 1930s but were updated and strengthened over the years, required drivers to take mandatory rest breaks after a certain number of hours on duty. Many drivers preferred to take these breaks at rest areas where parking was free, and they could sleep in their cabs without paying for parking. However, rest areas often had limited truck parking, particularly on busy routes where commercial freight was heavy. A rest area designed in the 1960s might have parking for 15 or 20 trucks, which seemed adequate at the time but became insufficient as freight volumes increased through the 1970s and 1980s. During peak travel periods or overnight hours, truck parking at popular rest areas would fill up completely, sometimes with trucks parked in areas not designated for parking because all official spaces were occupied. This parking shortage created safety issues. Drivers who couldn't find legal parking at rest areas sometimes stopped on highway shoulders or at closed way stations, creating hazards for themselves and other motorists. Federal regulations required rest breaks, but the infrastructure to support those breaks was inadequate in many corridors. States varied in how much truck parking they provided at rest areas. Some states, recognizing that commercial freight was essential to the economy and that providing adequate parking was a safety issue, built large dedicated truck parking areas. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states with heavy freight traffic made truck parking a priority, designing rest areas with parking for 50 or more trucks. Other states limited truck parking, either due to budget constraints or in response to complaints from nearby residents about noise from idling trucks. Rest areas in residential areas sometimes faced opposition to expansion because local communities didn't want the noise and activity associated with truck traffic. This tension between the need for truck parking and local quality of life concerns influenced rest area design and policy decisions. By the end of the 1980s, the rest area system was well established and widely used, but it was also beginning to show its age. Many facilities built in the 1960s and early 1970s were now 20 or 30 years old, with worn fixtures, outdated designs, and infrastructure that needed repair or replacement. Buildings that had seemed modern and fresh when new now looked dated. Materials that had been chosen for durability were showing wear. Systems that had been adequate for original usage levels were struggling with increased traffic. States faced decisions about whether to invest in renovations, close underutilized facilities, or build new rest areas to replace outdated ones. These decisions were complicated by budget pressures. Highway maintenance competed with other priorities for limited state funds. Rest areas were expensive to maintain. Each facility required regular cleaning, utilities, repairs, landscaping, and sometimes staffing. For a state with dozens of rest areas, the cumulative cost was substantial. Some facilities were showing serious structural problems. Roofs leaked, requiring expensive repairs or replacement. Plumbing systems deteriorated, with corroded pipes leading to water damage and reduced functionality. Electrical systems were outdated, inadequate for new requirements like improved lighting or electronic information kiosks. Parking lots had cracks and potholes from decades of freeze-thaw cycles and heavy use. Cosmetic issues were also apparent. Paint faded and peeled, tile cracked, fixtures showed years of wear. Landscaping had matured but sometimes overgrown, requiring more intensive maintenance than younger plantings. The overall impression at many rest areas was one of genteel decline, facilities that still functioned but looked tired and worn. The challenges facing rest areas at the end of the 1980s would intensify in the following decade, as aging infrastructure, budget constraints, and changing expectations converged to create pressure for significant changes in how rest areas were managed and maintained. 1990s, aging infrastructure, changing expectations, and funding challenges. The 1990s brought these challenges into sharper focus. Many original interstate rest areas were now 30 years old or more, and the signs of age were impossible to ignore. Buildings needed major repairs or replacement. Infrastructure systems, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, were failing or operating inefficiently. Parking lots required resurfacing. Landscaping needed renovation. The accumulated deferred maintenance represented a significant financial burden for state transportation departments. At the same time, budget pressures were intensifying. State transportation departments faced competing demands for limited funds. Highway maintenance was expensive and never-ending. Roads deteriorated constantly and required ongoing attention. Bridge repair and replacement represented massive capital expenses. In some states, transit systems needed support, traffic management systems, environmental remediation, safety improvements. All of these competed for funding from the same limited budgets. Rest areas, while used regularly by millions of travelers, were not the highest priority for most transportation departments. They didn't move people or goods directly. They didn't generate revenue. They were support facilities, important but not essential in the way that the roads themselves were essential. When budgets tightened, rest area maintenance and improvements tended to get deferred in favor of more critical needs. Some states responded to these pressures by closing rest areas, particularly those that were underutilized or costly to maintain. A facility on a less traveled route, where usage didn't justify the expense of operation, might be closed to save money. A rest area that duplicated another facility just 20 miles away might be deemed redundant and shut down. Buildings that would require extensive renovation to meet contemporary standards might be abandoned rather than repaired. The closed rest areas were handled in various ways. Some buildings were demolished, the sites returned to grass or left as vacant lots. The cost of demolition was substantial, so many closed facilities were simply abandoned, left to deteriorate. Vandalism and weather gradually destroyed these abandoned buildings, creating eyesores along the highway. A few closed rest areas were repurposed for other uses. A building might be converted to a highway maintenance facility, used to store equipment and materials for road crews. Or it might become a weigh station for commercial trucks, with the parking area converted to scales and inspection lanes. These adaptive reuses allowed the infrastructure investment to serve new purposes rather than being completely wasted. Other states chose to invest in renovations, updating aging facilities to meet contemporary standards and expectations. This investment was substantial. A major renovation might cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars per facility. But states that took this approach recognized that rest areas provided real value and that allowing them to deteriorate was a false economy. Renovations often meant improving accessibility for people with disabilities, as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990 and took effect in stages over the following years. The ADA established minimum standards for accessibility in public facilities, including rest areas. Compliance required extensive modifications to existing buildings and sites. Restrooms were retrofitted with accessible stalls, larger spaces that could accommodate wheelchairs, with grab bars mounted at specified locations and heights. Doors were widened to meet minimum width requirements. Thresholds were eliminated or ramped to allow wheelchair passage. Sinks were mounted at accessible heights, with clear space underneath for wheelchair users. Automatic door openers were installed at building entrances, allowing people with limited mobility to enter without needing to pull heavy doors. The buttons to activate these openers were mounted at accessible heights and locations. Parking lots were modified to add designated accessible spaces near building entrances. These spaces were wider than standard parking to allow room for wheelchair ramps and transfers. They were marked with distinctive signage and pavement markings, and they were positioned on the most level ground available to minimize difficulty for wheelchair users. Pedestrian paths were evaluated and often rebuilt to meet accessibility standards. The paths needed to be smooth, with minimal cross-slope, wide enough for wheelchairs, and free of obstacles. Existing paths that were too narrow or too steep were reconstructed. Curbs were ramped where paths crossed from one level to another. Picnic areas were modified to include accessible tables with extended tops that allowed wheelchair users to pull up to them, with clear space underneath for legs and footrests. At least some tables at each facility needed to meet these standards. These accessibility improvements benefited not just wheelchair users, but also people with other mobility limitations, those using canes or walkers, elderly people with limited endurance, parents pushing strollers. The changes made rest areas more usable for a broader range of people. Beyond legal requirements, renovations also addressed changing expectations about cleanliness and comfort. Travelers in the 1990s expected higher standards than had been typical in earlier decades. They wanted restrooms that were not just functional, but pleasant, bright, clean, well ventilated, free of odors. They wanted facilities that felt safe and well maintained. Some states responded by increasing cleaning frequencies. A rest area that had been cleaned once daily might move to twice daily service. High-traffic facilities might be cleaned continuously during peak hours, with maintenance staff present throughout the day to address issues immediately. Ventilation systems were improved to reduce odors and provide fresh air. Better exhaust fans were installed in restrooms. Fresh air intakes were positioned to draw clean air into buildings. In some cases, entire HVAC systems were replaced with more efficient, more effective units. Lighting was upgraded throughout facilities. Brighter bulbs, more fixtures, better placement, all contributed to spaces that felt safer and more welcoming. Parking lot lighting was particularly important for nighttime safety. Old lighting systems with widely spaced dim fixtures were replaced with more numerous, brighter lights that eliminated dark spots where people might feel vulnerable. Families traveling with young children had specific needs that renovation designers began to address. Baby changing stations were installed in both men's and women's restrooms, fold-down tables where parents could change diapers safely and hygienically. These had been rare in earlier decades, but became standard in the 1990s. Some renovated rest areas included family restrooms, single-occupancy spaces that could be used by a parent with children of the opposite sex, or by caregivers helping people who needed assistance. These rooms typically included a toilet, sink, and changing station, and they could be locked from the inside for privacy. Vending machine offerings continued to expand. In addition to snacks and drinks, machines began offering other items, pain relievers, hygiene products, phone cards, even disposable cameras. The goal was to provide items that travelers might need during their journeys, within the constraints of the non-commercial mandate. Information services evolved as well. Some renovated rest areas installed electronic information kiosks with touchscreen interfaces. These early systems allowed users to search for information about attractions, hotels, restaurants, and services along their route. The kiosks could display maps, show distances, and sometimes provide reviews or ratings of businesses. The technology was primitive by later standards: slow processors, low-resolution displays, limited information databases. The systems crashed frequently and required maintenance, but they represented an attempt to provide more interactive, more detailed information than was possible with static displays and printed brochures. Some kiosks included weather information, showing current conditions and forecasts for the region. This was valuable for travelers planning their routes, particularly in winter, when weather could affect road conditions significantly. A few experimental systems allowed users to make reservations, for state park campgrounds, for example. A traveler could check campground availability and reserve a site directly from the kiosk, printing a confirmation to bring to the campground office. These systems had mixed success, often hampered by connectivity issues and limited user interfaces. Security became a more prominent concern during the 1990s. Rest areas, particularly those in isolated locations or with poor lighting, could feel unsafe, especially at night. While actual crime at rest areas was relatively rare, the vast majority of visits were completely uneventful. Occasional incidents received significant media attention and created public anxiety. News reports of thefts from vehicles, assaults, or other crimes at rest areas fed perceptions that these facilities were dangerous. Some reports were accurate, documenting real incidents. Others were exaggerated or sensationalized. But the cumulative effect was increased concern about rest area safety, particularly among solo travelers and families. States responded with various security measures. Some increased patrol frequency, with state police or highway patrol making regular stops at rest areas. The presence of marked patrol vehicles provided reassurance to travelers and likely deterred some criminal activity. Officers would walk through facilities, check on parked vehicles, and make their presence visible. Better lighting was a key security improvement. Parking areas that had been dimly lit were re-illuminated with brighter, more numerous fixtures. Pedestrian paths received additional lighting to eliminate dark spots. Building exteriors were lit to make entrances and surrounding areas more visible. Some states experimented with video surveillance systems, installing cameras in parking areas and at building entrances. The cameras could be monitored remotely, and recordings could be reviewed if incidents occurred. However, budget constraints limited widespread adoption of video surveillance. The systems were expensive to install and maintain, requiring not just cameras, but also recording equipment, storage, power, and potentially monitoring staff. Design changes also aimed to improve security through visibility. Crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED principles, were applied to rest area renovations. These principles emphasized clear sightlines, elimination of hiding spots, natural surveillance from well-traveled areas, and clear definition of public versus restricted spaces. Renovated rest areas were often designed with more open layouts, fewer walls and partitions that could create blind spots, more windows allowing visibility into and out of buildings, landscaping that didn't provide concealment. The goal was to make the entire facility visible, to eliminate places where criminal activity could occur out of sight. Parking areas were configured to separate different user groups while maintaining visibility. Truck parking might be separated from car parking, but arranged so that both areas were visible from the main building. Picnic areas were positioned where they could be seen from parking areas, reducing isolation. Some states installed emergency call boxes at rest areas, dedicated phones that connected directly to law enforcement or emergency services. These phones were typically mounted on posts in parking areas, clearly marked and equipped with bright lights to make them visible. A person experiencing a medical emergency, car trouble, or safety concern could use the call box to summon help immediately. Despite these security concerns and the measures taken to address them, rest areas remained generally safe places. The overwhelming majority of visits involved no incidents whatsoever, just ordinary travelers using facilities, taking breaks, and continuing their journeys. The actual risk was low, but perception mattered, and states worked to ensure that rest areas not only were safe, but felt safe to users. Culturally, rest areas in the 1990s occupied an interesting position. For older travelers who had grown up taking family road trips in the 1960s and 1970s, rest areas evoked nostalgia. They were reminders of childhood vacations, of simpler times before air travel became cheap and ubiquitous, of the distinctive experience of interstate highway travel during its first few decades. For younger travelers who had come of age in the 1980s and 1990s, rest areas were simply utilitarian stops, less interesting than the increasingly elaborate private truck stops and travel centers appearing at exits. The travel center concept, which combined fuel, food, shopping and services in large commercial complexes at highway exits, offered more amenities and options than basic rest areas could provide. Chain truck stops like Flying J, Pilot, and Love's were building facilities that dwarfed earlier truck stops in size and scope. A modern travel center might occupy 20 or 30 acres, with extensive fuel facilities serving both passenger vehicles and trucks, multiple fast food restaurants under one roof, large convenience stores, gaming areas, and truck services. These complexes were designed to be destinations, places where travelers might spend 30 minutes or an hour rather than just making a quick stop. The contrast with public rest areas was stark. Rest areas remained free, but basic. Restrooms, parking, picnic tables, vending machines, information. Travel centers offered comprehensive services, but required spending money. You had to buy fuel or food or merchandise to justify your stop. The two types of facility served different needs and different segments of the traveling public. Some travelers preferred rest areas for their simplicity and their non-commercial nature. You could stop, use the facilities, and leave without being pressured to buy anything. The facilities were maintained with public funds and served a public purpose. There was something honest and straightforward about that. Other travelers preferred travel centers for their greater amenities. If you needed to buy fuel anyway, you might as well stop at a place that also had restaurants, ATMs, clean facilities, and other services. The commercial nature of the facilities meant they often had newer equipment, more staff, and more options than publicly funded rest areas. Photographers and preservationists began documenting classic rest area architecture during the 1990s, recognizing that many distinctive buildings from the 1960s and 1970s were being demolished or substantially altered. Photography projects catalogued the remaining examples of mid-century modern rest area design, highlighting their architectural significance and arguing that these buildings represented important examples of public architecture from a specific era. Some of the buildings were quite striking: angular concrete structures with dramatic roof lines, observation towers with 360-degree views, pavilions with distinctive geometric forms. They reflected the optimism and modernist aesthetics of their era, a time when public architecture could be bold and experimental, when highway infrastructure was seen as an opportunity for architectural expression rather than just utilitarian construction. As these buildings were demolished or renovated beyond recognition, architectural historians and photography enthusiasts documented what was being lost. Coffee table books featured photographs of rest areas, elevating them from forgettable roadside stops to subjects of aesthetic appreciation. Some facilities achieved a kind of cult status among people interested in mid-century architecture and roadside Americana. The rise of the Internet in the late 1990s began to change how travelers accessed information about rest areas and highway services. Early websites offered databases of rest area locations, sometimes with user reviews and photos. The information was often incomplete or outdated, but it represented the beginning of a shift from official sources to community-generated content about travel infrastructure. Online forums and discussion boards allowed travelers to share experiences and recommendations. Someone who had stopped at a particularly nice rest area might post about it, describing the facilities and recommending it to others. Conversely, warnings about rest areas with poor maintenance or security concerns could spread through these online communities. This information sharing would accelerate dramatically in the following decades as internet access became ubiquitous and smartphones put travel information in everyone's pocket. But in the late 1990s, it was still nascent, limited to people with internet access at home or work who thought to search for rest area information before their trips. By the end of the 1990s, rest areas were at a crossroads. The original vision of simple, non-commercial safety stops was still the dominant model, but it was under pressure from multiple directions. Aging infrastructure required expensive renovation or replacement. Budget constraints limited what states could afford to spend on facilities that didn't generate revenue. Changing traveler expectations demanded higher standards of cleanliness, comfort, and amenity. Competition from private travel centers raised questions about whether publicly funded rest areas were still necessary, or whether the private sector could adequately serve travelers' needs. Different states chose different paths forward. Some committed to maintaining and upgrading their rest area systems, viewing them as essential public infrastructure worth the investment. Others allowed facilities to decline or closed them entirely, determining that the costs outweighed the benefits. A few states explored public-private partnerships or other alternative funding mechanisms to support rest area operations. The question of rest areas' future role in highway infrastructure would only intensify in the following decades as technology, travel patterns, and fiscal realities continued to evolve. 21st century to present, modernization, consolidation, and the travel plaza era. The early 2000s saw these trends continue and intensify. States continued making decisions about which facilities to maintain, which to close, and which to upgrade. The general trend was toward consolidation. Fewer rest areas overall, but with the remaining facilities being larger, better equipped, and more comprehensively serving travelers' needs. New or substantially renovated rest areas incorporated contemporary design standards and expectations. Energy efficiency became a priority, driven by both environmental concerns and operational cost considerations. Buildings were designed with better insulation to reduce heating and cooling costs. Windows were positioned and sized to maximize natural light while minimizing heat gain or loss. HVAC systems were specified for efficiency, using modern equipment that could maintain comfort while consuming less energy than older systems. Some facilities incorporated renewable energy features. Solar panels appeared on roofs or in adjacent parking areas, generating electricity to offset utility costs. A few experimental facilities explored geothermal heating and cooling, using the Earth's stable subsurface temperature to reduce energy needs. These sustainable features aligned with broader environmental priorities and demonstrated leadership in green building practices. Water conservation received attention as well. Low-flow toilets and urinals reduced water consumption significantly compared to older fixtures. Some facilities installed waterless urinals, which used no water at all. Faucets were equipped with aerators that maintained pressure while reducing flow. In arid regions where water was scarce and expensive, these conservation measures provided both environmental and economic benefits. Restroom facilities continued to improve in quality and amenity. Touchless fixtures became more common. Automatic faucets, soap dispensers, paper towel dispensers, and flush valves that activated through sensors rather than manual operation. These touchless systems improved hygiene by reducing contact with potentially contaminated surfaces, and they helped control water and consumable usage. High-efficiency hand dryers began replacing paper towels at some facilities. These dryers used powerful air jets to remove water from hands in seconds, eliminating the ongoing expense and waste of paper towels. However, many travelers preferred paper towels, and the hand dryers were noisy, so some facilities maintained both options. Flooring materials evolved toward more durable, easier-to-clean surfaces. Polished concrete, sealed with modern coatings, provided a surface that was attractive, durable, and easily maintained. Ceramic or porcelain tile remained common, but with better grouts and sealants that resisted staining and made cleaning more effective. Wall finishes emphasized durability and cleanability. Glazed tile, solid surface materials, and specialized paints designed for high-traffic wet areas replaced materials that showed wear quickly. The goal was surfaces that could withstand intensive cleaning with commercial equipment and chemicals while maintaining their appearance. Accessibility continued to improve beyond minimum ADA requirements. Designers embraced universal design principles, creating spaces that were usable by everyone regardless of ability, rather than just meeting legal minimums for accommodation. This meant wider doorways, more spacious restroom layouts, better signage with pictographic symbols supplementing text, and layouts that were intuitive and easy to navigate. Technology integration became more sophisticated in the 2000s and 2010s. Free Wi-Fi appeared at many rest areas, recognizing that travelers expected internet access. The wireless networks were typically provided at minimal cost using commercial internet service, and they served both practical and recreational needs. Business travelers could check email, families could entertain children with streaming videos, anyone could access navigation and information services. The Wi-Fi networks varied in quality and capacity. Some provided robust, fast connections that could handle multiple simultaneous users. Others were slow and unreliable, with limited bandwidth that became congested when many people tried to connect. The digital divide was visible even at rest areas. Facilities in well-funded states with good connectivity had better Wi-Fi than those in areas with limited infrastructure investment. Electronic information displays replaced or supplemented printed brochures at many facilities. Large flat panel screens could display rotating information about attractions, services, road conditions, and weather. The displays could be updated remotely, ensuring information remained current. They could show traffic conditions on upcoming road segments, helping travelers plan their routes. Some facilities installed interactive touchscreen kiosks with more sophisticated capabilities than the early systems of the 1990s. These newer kiosks had better interfaces, more reliable software, and connections to current information databases. Travelers could search for restaurants, hotels, or attractions along their route, get directions, and sometimes even make reservations or purchases. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure began appearing at rest areas in the 2000s, initially in small numbers, but expanding rapidly as electric vehicle adoption increased. The federal government provided funding for EV charging through various programs, and some states prioritized rest areas as locations for chargers, recognizing that these were logical stopping points along highway routes. The charging stations varied in their speed and accessibility. Early installations often featured level 2 chargers, which provided moderate speed charging adequate for adding range during longer stops. As technology advanced, DC fast chargers became more common, capable of charging compatible vehicles to 80% in 30 minutes or less. The fastest charging technology could add hundreds of miles of range in similar timeframes. The presence of EV charging altered how some travelers used rest areas. Instead of quick stops, EV drivers might spend 30 to 45 minutes while their vehicles charged. This created opportunities and challenges. The extended stays meant travelers might want more amenities, comfortable seating, food and drink options, Wi-Fi. But it also meant parking spaces were occupied longer, potentially reducing availability for other users. Security continued to evolve with technology. More rest areas installed video surveillance systems as equipment costs declined and storage became cheaper. The systems deterred some criminal activity and provided evidence when incidents did occur. However, privacy concerns limited how surveillance could be used. Cameras couldn't be positioned where they would capture images of people using restrooms or in other private situations. Some states experimented with smartphone apps that provided information about rest areas. The apps could show locations, amenities available at each facility, and sometimes real-time information about parking availability or maintenance closures. Push notifications could alert drivers approaching rest areas or warn about closures ahead. These apps had mixed adoption. Some travelers found them useful for planning stops. Others preferred traditional methods, watching for blue signs, stopping when they felt the need. The apps required smartphone ownership and willingness to download and use additional software, which not all travelers had or wanted. Despite these technological additions, the basic function of rest areas remained unchanged, providing safe, predictable places for travelers to stop, use facilities, and rest before continuing their journeys. The modernization added convenience and amenity, but didn't fundamentally alter the purpose. Consolidation continued through the 2000s and 2010s, with some states closing older, smaller rest areas while investing in fewer but larger facilities. The rationale was economic efficiency. Maintaining one large facility well was often more cost-effective than maintaining multiple small facilities adequately. Larger facilities could offer more amenities, accommodate more vehicles, and provide better services while concentrating maintenance resources. The consolidated facilities were often substantial, large parking areas with spaces for 50 or more passenger vehicles and 30 or 40 trucks, buildings with multiple restroom facilities, extensive picnic areas, and comprehensive information services. They functioned as regional travel hubs, serving high volumes of traffic and providing a level of service that smaller facilities couldn't match. However, consolidation increased the distance between rest areas on some routes. Closing 3 small facilities and replacing them with one large facility might mean drivers faced 60 or 70 miles between stops instead of 20 or 30. For most travelers, this was manageable. but it could be problematic for people with medical conditions requiring frequent restroom access, for families with young children, or for drivers who needed breaks more frequently. Architectural approaches in contemporary rest areas vary widely. Some states embrace regional design traditions, creating buildings that reflect local culture and landscape. A rest area in the southwest might feature materials and forms drawn from Pueblo architecture. A facility in New England might reference colonial building traditions. The goal is creating a sense of place, helping travelers feel connected to the region they're passing through. Other states favor contemporary minimalism, simple, functional structures that prioritize efficiency and sustainability over regional character. These buildings might be metal and glass, with clean lines and neutral colors, designed to be built economically and maintained easily. The aesthetic is more generic, but often more practical, particularly in climates with extreme weather. A few states have commissioned notable architects to design signature rest areas that serve as architectural landmarks. These buildings receive recognition in architectural publications and sometimes win design awards. They elevate rest areas from purely functional infrastructure to objects of aesthetic interest. However, they're expensive to build and may not be cost-effective compared to simpler designs. Environmental sustainability has become a more prominent consideration in recent decades. Native plantings reduce water requirements and maintenance needs while supporting local ecosystems. Some rest areas include rain gardens or bioswales that manage stormwater naturally, filtering runoff before it enters drainage systems. Permeable paving materials allow water to infiltrate the ground rather than running off into storm drains. Energy-efficient building systems reduce operating costs and environmental impact. LED lighting has replaced older technologies throughout facilities, providing better illumination while using a fraction of the energy. Occupancy sensors turn lights off in spaces that aren't being used. Natural ventilation supplements, or replaces mechanical systems where climate allows. Some facilities incorporate interpretive displays about environmental conservation or sustainability features, educating visitors about green building practices and encouraging environmental stewardship. These displays explain how the facility was designed to minimize environmental impact and how similar approaches can be applied to other buildings. The private sector travel center industry continued to grow and evolve during this period. Major chains expanded their networks, building increasingly large and sophisticated facilities at strategic locations along high-traffic freight corridors. Modern travel centers evolved far beyond simple truck stops into comprehensive service complexes. A contemporary mega-travel center might occupy 50 acres or more, with fuel facilities capable of serving dozens of vehicles simultaneously, separate islands for diesel, gasoline, RV fuel, and sometimes alternative fuels like compressed natural gas. The fuel operations use point-of-sale systems that integrate with fleet management software, automatic payment processing, and loyalty programs. Inside, multiple national brand fast food restaurants operate under one roof, perhaps McDonald's, Subway, Taco Bell, and a pizza franchise, all in one building. This provides choice and familiarity for travelers who want recognizable brands. The restaurants operate their own kitchens and maintain their brand standards while sharing common seating areas. Convenience stores in modern travel centers are extensive operations, sometimes 8,000 or 10,000 square feet, carrying thousands of products. In addition to typical convenience store inventory, snacks, drinks, automotive supplies, they stock groceries, over-the-counter medications, electronics, clothing, truck parts and accessories, CB radios, GPS units, maps and atlases, travel supplies, and regional specialty products. Shower facilities have become standardized at major truck stops. Private rooms with showers, toilets, sinks, and bench seating, cleaned between users and available for rental by the shower, typically $10 to $15, or included free with fuel purchases above certain amounts. The better facilities maintain showers well, with hot water, good water pressure, and clean towels and amenities provided. Some travel centers include laundry facilities with multiple washers and dryers, allowing drivers to do laundry during their breaks. Drivers' lounges provide comfortable seating, large-screen televisions, often showing news or sports, Wi-Fi, sometimes gaming consoles or pool tables, creating spaces where drivers can relax during their off-duty hours. Medical clinics have appeared at some mega travel centers, offering basic healthcare services for drivers who need attention for minor issues, vaccinations, DOT, physical exams required for commercial driver's license renewal, treatment for minor illnesses or injuries. These clinics recognize that truck drivers spend weeks away from home and may not have easy access to regular healthcare. Fitness centers, barbershops, massage services, truck washes, maintenance facilities, and even dentists operate at some of the largest travel centers. These facilities essentially function as small towns dedicated to serving commercial drivers and other highway travelers, providing nearly any service someone might need during extended travel. The contrast between these elaborate commercial facilities and public rest areas is dramatic. Rest areas remain non-commercial, offering basic free amenities funded by state transportation budgets. Travel centers offer extensive services but require purchases to access most amenities. The two systems continue to coexist, serving different needs and different user priorities. Policy debates in the 21st century have revisited whether to allow more commercial activity within interstate rest areas. Proponents argue that modern service plazas, modeled on turnpike facilities, could provide better service to travelers while generating revenue to help fund highway infrastructure. The revenue could come from leasing fees paid by commercial operators, helping offset the cost of maintaining rest area facilities. Opponents, including existing truck stop and exit ramp businesses, argue that allowing commercial operations at rest areas would constitute unfair competition from government-subsidized facilities. Exit-based businesses have invested millions in land, buildings, and operations based on the rule that interstate rest areas would remain non-commercial. Changing that rule would undermine their investments and could force some businesses to close. The debate also involves questions about appropriate roles for government. Should states be in the business of leasing space for commercial operations, essentially becoming landlords for restaurant and fuel companies? Or should they focus on their core mission of building and maintaining roads, providing only basic non-commercial amenities for travelers? These questions have no easy answers, and policy varies by state and by political context. The basic federal restrictions from the 1960s remain largely intact for most interstates. Toll roads continue to operate service plazas with commercial services, but most free interstates still prohibit full commercial operations at rest areas. As a result, American rest areas today reflect a layered history spanning more than half a century. Early roadside parks from the 1960s still operate in some locations, updated and maintained, but recognizably of their era. Mid-century modern buildings with distinctive architecture stand alongside newer facilities with contemporary designs. The system is diverse, decentralized, evolving continuously while maintaining essential continuity in purpose and function. The future of rest areas remains somewhat uncertain. Autonomous vehicles, if widely adopted, might change how people use highways and what kinds of stops they need. If vehicles can drive themselves, passengers might be able to sleep or work during trips, potentially reducing the need for rest stops. Or autonomous vehicles might enable new travel patterns, longer trips, more frequent stops, different expectations about highway infrastructure, changing work patterns, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, include more remote work and flexible schedules. This might alter travel patterns, with less traditional weekday commuter traffic and more dispersed recreational travel. How this affects rest area usage is unclear. Climate concerns might drive shifts in transportation modes and vehicle technologies. If more people shift to electric vehicles, rest areas will need more charging infrastructure. If long-distance travel shifts from private vehicles to buses or trains, rest area usage might decline. If climate change makes certain regions less hospitable, travel patterns could shift. Yet the fundamental need that rest areas address seems likely to persist. As long as people drive long distances, and there's little indication this will stop anytime soon, they will need places to stop. They'll need restrooms. They'll need to stretch and walk. They'll need spaces to rest when fatigued. Rest areas provide these essential functions in ways that commercial facilities don't fully replicate. They're free, they're predictable, they're spaced systematically along routes. The specific forms may evolve. Buildings may look different. Amenities may change. Technology will continue to integrate. But the basic concept, public facilities along highways providing travelers with safe places to stop, has proven durable across more than 60 years and shows no signs of becoming obsolete. The highway stretches on. The car sits in the parking lot now, engine off, interior lights dim. Through the windshield, the rest area building is visible, its lights glowing steadily in the darkness. Inside, the fluorescent fixtures continue their work, illuminating tile floors and painted walls, casting even light across spaces designed for function and durability. A door opens. Someone exits the building, walks across the parking lot toward a vehicle. The footsteps are quiet on the pavement, barely audible over the distant sound of the highway. The person reaches their car, gets in, starts the engine. Headlights come on, illuminating the painted parking space lines, the landscaping beyond. The car backs out, follows the access road toward the highway, merges back into traffic, and disappears. Another vehicle arrives, pulling into the space that was just vacated. The cycle continues, has continued for decades, will likely continue for decades more. Different vehicles, different travelers, different journeys, but the same basic pattern repeated endlessly. The rest area remains, patient and constant. It doesn't close, it doesn't change its purpose. It simply exists, providing the same services it has provided for years: parking, restrooms, water, picnic facilities, information. The specifics have evolved, better lighting now than in 1970, accessible facilities that didn't exist in 1965, Wi-Fi that would have seemed like science fiction in 1980, but the essential function persists. The story of how this place came to exist, how the system of rest areas was built and maintained across more than 60 years, encompasses multiple eras of American history. It moves from the early automobile age through the interstate era, through contemporary times, reflecting changes in technology, culture, expectations, and priorities. Each era left its mark on the landscape. The 1960s created the basic template, standardized facilities spaced systematically along interstates, designed for safety and funded by public investment. The 1970s and 1980s were the high point of road trip culture, when rest areas became familiar parts of American family vacations. Places that held memories, even if the specific facilities weren't particularly memorable. The 1990s brought challenges of aging infrastructure and budget constraints, forcing difficult decisions about which facilities to maintain and how to fund necessary improvements. The 2000s and 2010s saw modernization and consolidation, with fewer but better facilities, integration of new technologies, and attempts to balance traditional functions with contemporary expectations. Through all these changes, rest areas maintained their core purpose. They provided places where travelers could stop safely, where basic needs could be met, where the journey could be interrupted briefly before continuing. This seems simple, almost mundane, but it represents a significant public investment and a particular vision of what highway infrastructure should include. The network of rest areas embodies certain principles about public responsibility and traveler safety. It reflects decisions made decades ago about what government should provide versus what private enterprise should supply. It demonstrates sustained commitment across multiple administrations and changing political priorities to maintaining infrastructure that doesn't generate revenue but serves genuine public needs. Standing in a rest area parking lot at night, these historical and policy dimensions are mostly invisible. What's visible is the building, the lights, the parking spaces, the highway in the distance. What's audible is the hum of vending machines, the occasional sound of a truck engine, the steady whisper of distant traffic. But the history is there, embedded in the layout of the facility, in the design of the building, in the standardized signage that guided you to this spot. The decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s about how to serve interstate travelers shaped the place where you're standing now. The investments made over decades in maintenance and improvements kept this facility functioning through years of weather and use. A truck pulls into the commercial vehicle parking area, air brakes releasing with their characteristic hiss. The driver parks, turns off the engine, leaves the running lights on. The cab will be home for the next 10 hours, the mandatory rest period before the next shift of driving. The rest area provides a safe, legal place for this break, fulfilling one of its fundamental purposes. In the passenger vehicle area, a car arrives with children visible in the back seat. The family gets out, stretches, walks toward the building. The children run ahead, energetic after hours in the car. The parents follow more slowly, carrying what they need for a quick stop: phones, wallets, perhaps a bag with snacks or bottles. They'll use the facilities, let the children play for a few minutes, then continue their journey. These ordinary moments, the truck driver's rest break, the family's bathroom stop, are what rest areas exist to facilitate. Not grand purposes or dramatic events, just the mundane necessities of long-distance travel, made easier by the availability of appropriate infrastructure. The night continues. Traffic on the highway flows steadily, an endless stream of vehicles moving toward distant destinations. Some will stop at this rest area. Most will pass by, perhaps planning to stop at the next one, or perhaps continuing to their destinations without stopping at all. The rest area doesn't depend on any particular vehicle stopping. It exists regardless of how many people use it at any given moment. Overnight, usage drops, fewer vehicles arrive, the parking lot empties somewhat, the building has periods with no one inside. But the lights stay on, the facilities remain available, the infrastructure persists. By dawn, traffic will increase, morning travelers will begin stopping. People who started driving early to avoid traffic, truck drivers reaching the end of overnight shifts, families beginning vacation trips. The pattern will repeat, as it has repeated for decades. Inside the building, the fluorescent lights continue their steady illumination. The tile floors reflect that light in subtle patterns, determined by their surface texture and the angle of the illumination. The restrooms wait, clean and ready for the next users. The vending machines hum their electrical songs. The water fountain stands ready to provide its simple service. Everything is designed for function, for durability, for serving the needs of travelers who will spend perhaps 10 or 15 minutes here before moving on. There's no luxury, no elegance beyond what functional design provides. But there's something admirable in that simplicity, that clear focus on purpose. The highway stretches on in both directions, disappearing into darkness in one direction, into the gradual lightening of dawn in the other. The pavement carries its endless traffic, vehicles moving at highway speeds, covering distances that would have taken days in earlier eras, now measured in hours. And at regular intervals along that highway, rest areas wait. Some are small, basic facilities with minimal amenities. Others are larger, more elaborate, offering more services and accommodating more vehicles. But all serve the same essential function, providing safe places for travelers to pause. The blue signs mark their locations, visible from the highway, standardized symbols that need no translation. Rest area, 2 miles. The information is simple, clear, universal. A driver who sees that sign knows what it means, knows what they'll find at the exit. Parking, restrooms, picnic facilities, information. This predictability is part of the value. You don't need to research rest areas before your trip. You don't need to plan which specific facilities you'll use. You just know that every 30 or 40 miles, there will be another option, another opportunity to stop. The system removes uncertainty from one aspect of highway travel. The car that arrived earlier still sits in its parking space. Inside, someone sleeps, taking advantage of the rest area's implicit permission to rest here. This wasn't the intended purpose when rest areas were designed. They were meant for short breaks, not extended stays. But the practice is tolerated, recognized as serving safety goals. Better for someone to sleep here than to continue driving while drowsy. As morning light strengthens, the parking lot becomes more visible. The painted lines marking spaces, the landscaping beyond the pavement, the building with its functional architecture, all become clearer as darkness yields to day. The overnight stillness gives way to increasing activity as more travelers arrive. The story of rest areas is ultimately a story about infrastructure, how it's built, how it's maintained, how it evolves over time, how it serves changing needs while maintaining essential continuity. Infrastructure tends to be invisible until it fails, or until its absence is felt. Rest areas are part of that invisible infrastructure of American life, noticed mainly when needed, taken for granted the rest of the time. But they represent significant investment and sustained commitment. Every rest area required planning, design, construction, and decades of maintenance. Every facility requires ongoing cleaning, repairs, utilities, landscaping. The cumulative expense across a state's entire rest area system is substantial, funded by transportation budgets that face constant pressure from competing needs. That states continue to maintain these facilities, continue to invest in their upkeep and improvement, reflects a judgment that they're worth the cost. That travelers continue to use them, continue to rely on them for breaks during long journeys, validates that judgment. The system works, not perfectly, but adequately, serving millions of travelers each year. The sun rises higher, more vehicles arrive. The parking lot fills and empties in irregular patterns as travelers come and go. Inside the building, the restrooms see steady use. The vending machines dispense snacks and drinks. The water fountain provides its simple service. The information displays show their maps and brochures to anyone interested. Another ordinary day at a highway rest area. Another day of serving travelers, providing basic amenities, facilitating journeys. The work is unglamorous, the facilities utilitarian, the purpose straightforward. But the cumulative effect across the entire network of rest areas is significant. Millions of safe stops, countless travelers served. A small but essential contribution to the functioning of America's highway system. The highway continues its work too, carrying traffic hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The pavement bears the weight of countless vehicles. The painted lines guide drivers toward their destinations. The signs provide necessary information. And at intervals along that highway, the rest areas wait, ready for whoever needs them. This is infrastructure at its most basic and most essential. Simple facilities serving clear purposes, maintained consistently, available when needed. Not celebrated, not noticed most of the time, but fundamental to how the system works. The story that began with simple picnic tables along Michigan roads in 1929 has grown into a comprehensive network of facilities serving interstate highways across the country. The details have changed. Buildings are different now than in 1960. Amenities have expanded. Technology has been integrated. But the core concept persists. Public facilities along highways where travelers can safely stop. That persistence across nearly a century of change suggests something fundamental about the need being served. As long as people travel long distances by road, they need places to stop. The specific forms may evolve, but the essential function remains. The rest area sits quietly along its highway, lights on, facilities ready, performing its patient work. The building shows the wear of years but continues functioning. The parking lot bears the marks of weather and use, but continues serving its purpose. The whole facility exists in a state of maintained adequacy, good enough to serve its function, not deteriorating into dysfunction, not elevated to excellence. This is the sustainable middle ground that infrastructure occupies when it's working properly. Not failing, not luxury, just adequate service maintained consistently. It's not inspiring, but it's what makes modern life possible. Traffic flows, travelers stop, the cycle continues. and the highway stretches on, its rest areas spaced at regular intervals, constant points in a landscape of constant motion, places of brief pause in journeys measured in hundreds of miles. The pavement rolls beneath tires, the white lines pass, the blue signs announce, rest area, next exit. And for another generation of travelers, the familiar pattern repeats: the deceleration, the exit, the parking, the brief stop, the return to the highway, the journey continuing. The rest area remains, as it has remained for decades, as it will likely remain for decades to come, serving its simple purpose with quiet persistence. The highway stretches on, disappearing into distance, carrying its endless traffic toward destinations known and unknown, with rest areas standing ready at intervals, lights glowing softly, facilities waiting, infrastructure performing its essential work. The story continues even now in the present moment, as vehicles arrive and depart, as the facilities serve their purpose, as the system functions as designed, as the highway and its rest areas together enable the movement of people and goods across vast distances. This is the infrastructure of American mobility: highways and rest areas, pavement and facilities, continuous motion and brief pauses, all working together to make long-distance travel possible, practical, and reasonably safe. The night gives way to day. The day will give way to night again. And through it all, the rest areas will remain, patient and persistent, performing their work, serving their purpose, contributing their modest but essential part to the functioning of the system. The highway stretches on, the rest areas wait, the journey continues.